That's presumptuous, Cassandra managed, but her voice lacked conviction because he was right and they both knew it. Is it? Luca's other hand settled on her waist, pulling her closer with slow deliberation that gave her every opportunity to pull away if she chose. Because I don't think I'm wrong. I think you're standing here trying to talk yourself into leaving when what you actually want is excuse to stay. So let me give you one. Stay because you want to. Because what we have is worth exploring despite complicated beginning. Because you love me and I love you, and sometimes that's enough reason even when logic suggests otherwise. Cassandra Monroe's career as an investigative journalist had died spectacularly 18 months ago in a courtroom where lawyers with designer suits and unlimited billable hours had systematically dismantled every shred of credibility she'd spent a decade building. The article that had destroyed her had been titled, "The Shadow Circle: How Boston's Elite Hide Billions in Blood Money," and it had been published with the kind of righteous conviction that came from believing truth alone would protect her from consequences. She'd been wrong, catastrophically, career-endingly wrong, because while every instinct had screamed that the connections she'd identified were real, that the money trails led exactly where she'd claimed, she'd lacked the concrete evidence that separated investigative journalism from libel. The lawsuits had come within hours of publication, orchestrated with the kind of synchronized precision that actually proved her thesis about coordinated criminal networks even as it destroyed her ability to publish anything about them. Her editor had retracted the story before the ink was metaphorically dry. The publication had settled out of court for undisclosed sums that probably bought someone a small yacht, and Cassandra had found herself radioactive in an industry where reputation was currency and hers had been devalued to approximately zero. No one would hire her. No one would even return her calls. She'd gone from rising star whose investigative pieces had won awards to cautionary tale that journalism professors used to warn students about the dangers of insufficient sourcing. She'd spent the past 18 months working as a fact-checker for a celebrity gossip website, a position so far beneath her qualifications that her former colleagues had stopped making eye contact when they passed her in coffee shops, and trying to figure out how to resurrect a career from ashes that most people would have accepted as permanent. But Cassandra had never been particularly good at accepting defeat, which was either admirable perseverance or pathological inability to recognize when situations were genuinely hopeless depending on who you asked and how charitable they were feeling. So when the anonymous email had arrived in her inbox 3 days ago with the subject line, "The proof you needed," and coordinates for a location where she could supposedly obtain documentation of everything she'd claimed in her disastrous article, Cassandra had spent approximately 30 seconds considering whether this was obviously a trap before deciding she didn't care. Desperation had a way of making terrible decisions look reasonable, and she was desperate enough that meeting anonymous sources in isolated locations seemed like calculated risk rather than suicide mission. The coordinates had led her to an abandoned warehouse on the waterfront, because of course they had, because apparently every criminal conspiracy in human history conducted business in locations that screamed, "This is definitely where murders happen." And Cassandra had arrived after sunset with her phone set to automatically upload everything to cloud storage if she didn't check in within 2 hours. It was the kind of precaution that suggested she understood the danger while simultaneously planning to ignore it, which probably said concerning things about her judgment, but she'd stopped interrogating her own decision-making around the time her career had imploded. She'd made it perhaps 20 feet into the warehouse, her phone's flashlight cutting through darkness that smelled like rust and seawater and something organic that was probably mold but could conceivably have been decomposition, when she'd heard the footsteps behind her. Not heard them exactly, more like registered their absence too late, the sudden awareness that she wasn't alone arriving in the same moment that something sharp pricked her neck with the efficient precision of someone who'd done this many times before. What? Cassandra had managed, her hand coming up to the injection site, her mind already cataloging symptoms with the detached professionalism that came from having researched approximately every method of incapacitation during her investigative career. Sedative, probably something fast-acting, her vision already blurring at the edges and her legs becoming unreliable in ways that suggested she had perhaps seconds before consciousness abandoned her entirely. She tried to run anyway, because Cassandra Monroe didn't go quietly even when going quietly would have been tactically sound. But her body had stopped cooperating before she'd made it 3 steps, the warehouse floor rushing up to meet her face with the inevitability of gravity and poor life choices. The last thing she'd registered before darkness claimed her completely was rough hands catching her before she hit the ground, someone's voice saying something in language she didn't recognize, and the bitter recognition that she'd walked into exactly the trap everyone with functional survival instincts would have avoided. Consciousness returned in fragmented pieces. First awareness of movement beneath her, gentle swaying that her disoriented brain initially categorized as earthquake before pattern recognition kicked in and identified it as water. Boat. She was on a boat. Second came the realization that she couldn't move her arms or legs, restraints binding her wrists behind her and her ankles to chair legs with the kind of thorough immobilization that suggested her captors were either very professional or very paranoid. Third came the gag in her mouth, fabric that tasted like seawater and prevented her from doing anything except making muffled sounds of protest that no one would interpret as threatening. The room she found herself in was expensively appointed in ways that suggested yacht rather than fishing vessel. Polished wood paneling, leather furniture that probably cost more than Cassandra's annual salary back when she'd had actual salary, ambient lighting designed to create atmosphere rather than simply illuminate. It was the kind of space where wealthy people conducted business they didn't want public records of, and Cassandra's stomach dropped with the recognition that she'd severely underestimated exactly what kind of danger she'd walked into. 4 men occupied the room with her, their presence immediately cataloging itself into threat assessment that Cassandra's survival instincts began processing despite the sedative still making her thoughts feel like they were moving through honey. 3 of them stood in loose semicircle in front of her, mid-30s to early 40s, expensive casual wear that suggested wealth without ostentation, body language projecting the kind of relaxed confidence that came from knowing they held all the power in current situation. They were looking at her with expressions that ranged from amused to predatory, their conversation in Italian carrying tone of men discussing interesting acquisition rather than human being. The 4th man sat slightly apart from the others, positioned near the windows where moonlight cut through the room in silver slashes that made him look like figure from noir film. He was younger than the others, perhaps early 30s, with the kind of dark, austere handsomeness that suggested Mediterranean ancestry and excellent bone structure. But it was his stillness that drew attention, the way he watched the proceedings with intensity that made Cassandra's instincts scream warnings about apex predators who didn't need to posture because their dominance was simply accepted fact. He hadn't spoken since Cassandra regained consciousness, hadn't participated in the other men's conversation, hadn't even acknowledged her presence directly. But his attention was unmistakably fixed on her, his dark eyes tracking every movement she made as she tested her restraints and tried to communicate through muffled sounds that keeping her here was legally actionable kidnapping and they should really reconsider their life choices before this escalated into federal charges. "She's awake," one of the 3 men said in accented English, his tone suggesting this was source of entertainment rather than concern. "Good. I was worried Luca had used too much sedative and we'd have to wait. That would have been disappointing." "What do you want to do with her?" another asked, his question directed at the group rather than specifically at the silent man who Cassandra was increasingly certain held actual authority despite not participating in the discussion. "She came looking for proof about our operations. That suggests either remarkable courage or remarkable stupidity. Possibly both." "I vote we find out which," the 3rd man said, moving closer to Cassandra's chair with the kind of predatory interest that made her survival instincts transition from warning to full alarm. "We could ask her questions. See what she knows. What she's already published. Who else might have copies of her research? It would be educational." "Or," the 1st man interjected with a smile that made Cassandra's blood run cold, "we could make a game of it. Something more interesting than simple interrogation. We have 4 yachts here, 1 for each of us. And we have 1 uninvited guest who thought she could investigate our business without consequences. Why not let fate decide who gets to teach her exactly how bad her judgment was?" The suggestion hung in the air with weight that suggested this wasn't spontaneous cruelty but established pattern, that these men had done this before with other people who'd gotten too close to whatever criminal enterprise they were operating. Cassandra's mind raced through options and found them all inadequate. She was restrained, outnumbered, on a boat in the middle of what was probably the ocean, and her phone with its emergency protocols was almost certainly long gone. "Spin her," the 2nd man said with enthusiasm that suggested he found this proposal entertaining rather than horrifying. "Whoever she stops facing keeps her. Does whatever he wants with her. It's fair. Democratic even. Let chance decide rather than fighting over the prize." "That's not democratic, that's deeply psychotic," Cassandra tried to say, but the gag reduced her objection to muffled sounds that only seemed to amuse her captors more. She struggled against the restraints with renewed violence, her chair rocking slightly despite being too heavy to tip, her mind screaming protests that her voice couldn't articulate about exactly how many laws were being violated and how prison was definitely where all of them belonged. The 1st man moved to spin her chair, actually placed his hands on the backrest and began rotating her like she was furniture rather than human being, and Cassandra felt panic truly set in as she processed that they were actually doing this, actually treating her abduction like game with herself as prize. The room blurred as she spun, her stomach protesting the motion, her eyes trying to track the men's positions and failing as momentum carried her through rotations that made spatial awareness impossible. But even through the disorientation, even as her brain struggled to process which direction was forward, Cassandra noticed something that made her already racing heart accelerate further. The silent man, the one who hadn't participated in the decision, who'd been watching with unsettling intensity, shifted in his seat as the chair spun past him. His jaw clenched with tension that looked almost like discomfort. His hands flexed against the chair arms like he was fighting instinct to intervene. His entire body language projected disapproval that he apparently wasn't willing to voice in front of the others. Pride, Cassandra's mind supplied with the clarity that sometimes came during crisis. He disapproved, but his pride wouldn't let him look weak by objecting to what the others had proposed. Which meant he had some kind of authority they might listen to if he chose to use it, but he was choosing silence over protection because whatever hierarchy existed between these men wouldn't survive him appearing soft about their entertainment. The chair slowed, momentum bleeding away with the inevitability of physics, and Cassandra found herself facing the third man, the one who'd suggested interrogation, whose expression now held anticipation that made her stomach turn with recognition of exactly what he'd meant by teaching her about bad judgment. "Well," he said, his smile widening with satisfaction. "Looks like fate has spoken. She's mine. I promise to be thorough with the education." "No." Cassandra tried to scream through the gag, her struggles renewing with desperate violence that made her chair rock dangerously. "This is insane. You can't just, this is kidnapping. This is." But they were already moving, two men unlocking her restraints from the chair while keeping her wrists and ankles bound, lifting her with casual efficiency that suggested they'd done this before with other people who'd protested just as unsuccessfully. The third man, her new captor, the man who'd apparently won her in their psychotic lottery, walked ahead of them toward the deck, and Cassandra caught glimpse through the windows of what had been described. For yachts anchored in loose formation, their running lights creating constellation against the dark water. They carried her out of the cabin into night air that was surprisingly cold against her skin, the wind carrying salt spray and the sound of waves against hulls. Another yacht was pulling alongside, sleek white vessel that looked like it belonged in luxury vacation catalog rather than criminal kidnapping operation, and they were preparing to transfer her across the gap between boats when one of the men grabbed her roughly, causing her shirt to ride up and expose her midriff. The tattoo wrapped around her waist was visible for perhaps 3 seconds, intricate design of waves and flowers that she'd gotten during a trip to Thailand, that wrapped from her hip bone around to her spine, that she'd chosen specifically because it could be hidden under normal clothing but revealed during the summer when she wore crop tops or swimsuits. It was personal art that she'd never expected would be relevant to anything except her aesthetic choices. But on the black yacht, the one they were moving away from, the one belonging to the silent man, something changed. Cassandra couldn't see him from her position being manhandled between vessels, but she heard the sound of sudden movement, chair scraping against deck, footsteps that moved with purpose rather than casual observation. On that black yacht, Luca Mancini's world reorganized itself around a memory he'd spent 5 years trying to reconstruct from fragments that had never quite solidified into coherent narrative. He'd been drowning, that much had always been clear, the water closing over his head after the yacht explosion that had been meant to kill him, his rival's assassination attempt nearly successful as his body betrayed him and his lungs filled with seawater. He remembered the darkness, the pressure, the resigned acceptance that he was going to die at age 27 because he'd trusted the wrong person with his schedule. And then, hands. Small hands grabbing his jacket, pulling him with strength that seemed impossible given her size, dragging him toward the surface through water that wanted to keep him. Breaking through into air that burned his lungs but meant he was still alive. Being hauled onto shore by a woman whose face he'd never clearly seen, whose silhouette had disappeared into the darkness before his men had arrived with boats and medical equipment and questions about how their boss had survived when the explosion should have killed him instantly. He'd spent 5 years searching for that woman, deploying resources that could have toppled small governments to find someone identified only by memory of her pulling him through water and the fleeting glimpse of a tattoo around her waist that he'd seen while underwater, his consciousness flickering in and out but his mind somehow cataloging that detail amid the chaos. He'd never found her. She'd vanished as thoroughly as if she'd been ghost rather than flesh and blood, and eventually Luca had accepted that some debts couldn't be repaid because the creditor had chosen to remain anonymous. Until now. Until this moment, watching a bound woman being transferred between yachts, her shirt riding up to reveal tattoo that matched the memory burned into his mind with the clarity that came from owing someone your life. It was her. The woman who'd saved him. The one who'd pulled him from the water and disappeared before he could even learn her name. And she was currently being claimed by Lorenzo Vitali, a man whose entertainment tended to leave permanent damage even when his victims technically survived, because Luca's pride had prevented him from objecting to their psychotic roulette game. The realization snapped him into action with a kind of focused intensity that had made him the most feared man in their circle despite being youngest. "Stop," he commanded, his voice carrying across the water with authority that made even Lorenzo's men hesitate mid-transfer. "Bring her back. Now." "Luca," Lorenzo called from his yacht, his tone holding warning about overstepping boundaries. "The game is done. She's mine now. You can't intervene after fate has spoken." "Fate," Luca replied, already moving toward the helm of his yacht with purpose that suggested negotiation was not going to occur, "is about to speak again. And it's saying you don't touch her. Bring her back or I come get her. Your choice which method you prefer." He didn't wait for Lorenzo's response. Didn't waste time on explanations that would require admitting he owed this woman a debt that transcended their usual rules about claims and games. He simply fired up the black yacht's engines and steered directly toward Lorenzo's vessel with a kind of reckless acceleration that suggested he was willing to ram the other boat if that's what retrieving her required. Cassandra watched in disbelief as the black yacht closed the distance with speed that seemed impossible for something that size. The man who'd been silent observer suddenly transformed into active threat, bearing down on them with single-minded purpose. The men holding her loosened their grips with uncertainty, clearly torn between following Lorenzo's orders and avoiding collision with someone who apparently outranked their boss in whatever hierarchy governed their criminal organization. The gap between yachts was perhaps 10 feet when Luca made his move, a running leap from his own vessel's deck onto Lorenzo's with the kind of athletic precision that suggested this wasn't his first time boarding another boat without permission. He landed in crouch that absorbed the impact, came up already moving toward where Cassandra was still restrained between two very confused guards, and his expression when she finally got clear look at his face was absolutely terrifying in its focused intensity. "Let her go," Luca said quietly, his voice carrying none of the shouting that usually accompanied confrontations but projecting threat that made even Lorenzo's largest guard step back. "Now, before this becomes significantly more complicated for everyone involved. You can't just take her," Lorenzo protested, emerging from his yacht's cabin with expression that cycled between anger and calculation. "The game was agreed upon. You didn't object when we proposed it. You can't change the rules now because—" He didn't finish the sentence. Luca moved with speed that made Cassandra's eyes widen despite being generally accustomed to violence from her investigative work, his fist connecting with the guard's jaw in strike that was efficient rather than showy, his other hand already grabbing the second guard and throwing him with casual force that sent the man stumbling into the railing. The brief fight that followed was brutal and one-sided, Luca dismantling Lorenzo's security with the kind of practiced efficiency that suggested he'd been trained by people who understood violence as craft rather than simply application of strength. When the guards were neutralized, unconscious or too injured to continue depending on how fortunate they'd been, Luca turned to Cassandra with expression that she couldn't quite read. "This is going to be uncomfortable," he said, his tone suggesting apology he wasn't actually going to voice. "But I need you to trust me for approximately the next 5 minutes, and then we can discuss exactly what you were thinking investigating people who'd obviously kill you without hesitation." He picked her up with the kind of easy strength that suggested she weighed approximately nothing, cradled her against his chest in a way that was probably meant to be reassuring but mainly made Cassandra aware of exactly how helpless she was in this situation. And then he was moving, back across Lorenzo's deck, stepping up onto the railing with balance that seemed impossible while carrying another person, and then jumping the gap between yachts with athletic confidence that made Cassandra's already racing heart try to escape through her throat. They landed on the black yacht's deck with impact that Luca absorbed through his legs, his hold on Cassandra tightening slightly to ensure she didn't slide, and then he was moving toward the cabin without pausing to see if Lorenzo was pursuing. The other yacht's engines roared to life behind them but Luca was already steering the black yacht away, opening distance with speed that made pursuit seem inadvisable for anyone who valued their vessel's hull integrity. Cassandra's mind was still struggling to process what had just happened. Kidnapped, spun like a prize wheel, nearly assaulted, and then rescued by the silent man who'd been watching the entire thing with discomfort he hadn't been willing to voice. When Luca finally set her down on the cabin's leather couch and knelt in front of her with knife that made her flinch despite recognizing he was probably going to use it to cut her restraints rather than stab her. "Hold still," he instructed, his voice still carrying that quiet intensity that suggested he was processing multiple complicated emotions simultaneously. I'm going to remove the gag first, then cut the restraints. And then you're going to tell me exactly why the woman who saved my life 5 years ago decided investigating Mafia operations was a good idea, because I'm genuinely curious what thought process led to you being kidnapped by people who would have tortured you for entertainment. He pulled the gag free and Cassandra immediately opened her mouth too. She wasn't sure what exactly, probably some combination of demanding explanation and articulating exactly how many laws had been violated, but what came out instead was, "You remember me? From 5 years ago? I pulled you out of the water but I thought you'd been unconscious. I didn't think you'd, how did you even recognize me? It was dark and you were half dead and I was very carefully not staying long enough to be identified." "Your tattoo," Luca replied, already working on the rope around her wrists with efficient knife work that suggested he'd done this before. "I saw it while I was underwater, right before I lost consciousness. My brain catalogued it as the thing that would let me find you if I survived. Spent 5 years looking for woman with wave tattoo around her waist who'd been on that beach the night I nearly died. Never found her. And now she shows up on Lorenzo's yacht about to be claimed as prize in the most psychotic game I've participated in without stopping. You want to explain how that happened?" "I was investigating criminal organizations," Cassandra said, flexing her newly freed hands despite the pins and needles sensation suggesting her circulation had been compromised. "Got an anonymous tip about meeting where I could get proof. Turns out the tip was from people who wanted to kidnap me rather than help my journalism career. Honestly, not my best work in terms of source verification." "You think?" Luca's voice carried something that might have been amusement under the tension. "Because from my perspective, you walked into obvious traps set by people who absolutely would have killed you after Lorenzo got bored, and the only reason you're not currently being traumatized in ways that would require extensive therapy is that I happened to notice your tattoo before they transferred you permanently to his yacht. That's not investigative journalism. That's suicide attempt with extra steps." "I was desperate," Cassandra admitted, because he wasn't wrong about the stupidity of her choices. "My career was destroyed 18 months ago because I published story about criminal networks without sufficient evidence. I was trying to get that evidence. Apparently my methods need work." "Your methods need complete overhaul," Luca corrected, finally freeing her ankles and sitting back on his heels to look at her directly. "But we'll address your catastrophically bad judgment later. Right now, I need to get you somewhere safe before Lorenzo decides that taking you from him was declaration of war rather than simply reclaiming debt. Can you walk or do I need to carry you again?" Cassandra tested her legs and found them reasonably functional despite the restraints and the sedative that was still making everything feel slightly disconnected. "I can walk," she said firmly, standing to prove it even though her balance was questionable. "But I'm not going anywhere with you until you explain exactly what you mean by reclaiming debt, and why you think kidnapping me from your friend's yacht is somehow morally superior to letting him keep me. Because from my perspective, I'm still being held against my will by dangerous criminals regardless of which one currently has possession." "Lorenzo wasn't going to keep you," Luca replied, his expression suggesting he wasn't comfortable with the explanation he was about to provide. "He was going to use you and then dispose of you once you stopped being entertaining. That's what he does with the people who end up on his yacht. That's what would have happened to you if I hadn't intervened. And as for why I intervened, you saved my life. That creates obligation I take seriously. Which means you're under my protection now whether you want to be or not. We can discuss the philosophical implications of benevolent kidnapping later, but right now we're going back to shore before this situation escalates into actual warfare." He moved toward the helm, leaving Cassandra standing in the cabin trying to process that she'd apparently been rescued by the man whose life she'd saved 5 years ago, who seemed to believe this created some kind of debt that justified taking her from another criminal's yacht but not actually giving her freedom to leave. The logic was circular and deeply questionable, but it was also probably keeping her alive in the short term, which meant arguing about it while still on a yacht surrounded by people who wanted to hurt her seemed tactically inadvisable. She'd saved the Defiance for when they reached shore and she had better options for escape than jumping into ocean and hoping her swimming skills would carry her to land before hypothermia set in. For now, she was apparently the possession of a man who'd spent 5 years looking for her and who seemed to believe saving his life had created permanent connection between them. That was going to be a problem. But it was better problem than being Lorenzo's entertainment. Marginally better. Maybe. Cassandra's judgment really had been spectacularly bad today. The black yacht docked at a private marina that looked like it catered exclusively to people whose wealth was measured in billions rather than millions, the slips filled with vessels that would have made Cassandra's former editor weep with envy for the lifestyle journalism opportunities they represented. Luca had made the journey in tense silence, his attention divided between steering and monitoring communications that apparently indicated Lorenzo was very angry about the theft of his claimed prize and was making threats that involved words Cassandra's basic Italian couldn't quite translate but that sounded distinctly violent. "Stay close to me," Luca instructed as they disembarked, his hand settling on her lower back with possessive casualness that made Cassandra's defiance instincts immediately bristle despite recognizing that now was not the tactical moment for asserting independence. "Lorenzo's people are watching the marina. If they get another chance to take you, they will. And this time I might not be in position to intervene before something permanent happens." "So your solution is to keep me as your prisoner instead?" Cassandra asked, her voice carrying edge that suggested she was done being cooperative. "Because I appreciate the rescue from imminent sexual assault, but I'm not particularly interested in trading one captor for another. I have rights. I have a life. I'm not your property just because you think you owe me for pulling you out of the water 5 years ago." "Your rights," Luca replied with the kind of patience that suggested he'd been expecting this argument, "are temporarily suspended by the reality that Lorenzo's people will absolutely kill you if they catch you unprotected. You've been marked now. Claimed by him in front of witnesses before I took you. That makes you target for retribution regardless of whether you want to be involved in our world. Your life as you knew it ended the moment you got on that yacht. The question isn't whether you're going to be under someone's protection. The question is whether it's going to be mine or theirs." The casual certainty with which he delivered this assessment made Cassandra's blood boil with the kind of fury that came from having men make decisions about her safety without consulting her preferences. "That's not a real choice," she protested, jerking away from his touch despite the security risk. "That's you telling me I have to accept your protection because the alternative is death. Well, maybe I'd rather take my chances with the authorities. I'm a journalist. I can testify about what happened on that yacht. I can put all of you in prison where you belong for kidnapping and assault and whatever else I can get charges for." "You can try," Luca agreed, his tone suggesting he didn't consider this a genuine threat. "And the authorities will take your statement and possibly even charge some people who aren't important enough to be protected by corruption. But Lorenzo isn't going to prison based on your testimony, and his retaliation against witnesses isn't going to be stopped by police protection. You'd last maybe a week before someone got to you. Is that really how you want this to end?" Cassandra opened her mouth to argue, to insist that witness protection existed for exactly this kind of situation, to maintain that she wasn't going to simply surrender her autonomy because some criminal thought he knew better than her about her own safety. But before she could articulate her objections, 3 black SUVs pulled into the marina's parking area with the kind of synchronized timing that suggested they'd been waiting for Luca's arrival. "My men," Luca said unnecessarily, his body language shifting to something more relaxed as the vehicles disgorged approximately a dozen armed guards who moved with military precision. "They'll escort us to my estate. You can continue protesting your circumstances there, where you'll be safe to throw whatever tantrum you're clearly planning without worrying about being kidnapped mid-argument." "I don't throw tantrums," Cassandra replied icily, even as she was being efficiently guided toward the lead SUV by guards who treated her with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask the fact that she was absolutely not being given choice about getting in the vehicle. "I articulate logical objections to unreasonable situations. There's a difference." "I'm sure there is," Luca murmured, sliding into the SUV beside her with fluid grace that suggested he was very comfortable being driven in vehicles that probably cost more than Cassandra's childhood home. "Feel free to articulate all your logical objections during the drive. I promise to listen attentively while I make phone calls that will keep Lorenzo from declaring war over my theft of his property." The drive took approximately 40 minutes, the SUVs moving through city streets and then increasingly rural roads until they reached a state that made Cassandra's eyes widen despite her determination not to be impressed by displays of wealth accumulated through criminal enterprise. The property was massive. Multiple buildings, extensive grounds, security that was visible but not ostentatious, the kind of place where powerful people conducted business they didn't want public records of. It was beautiful in ways that made her instinctively distrust it, because nothing that looked this perfect could be legitimate. She was shown to a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment had been before the lawsuits had forced her into considerably more modest housing, the space decorated with taste that suggested someone had actually paid attention to aesthetics rather than simply spending money until the result looked expensive. There was a bathroom with fixtures that belonged in architecture magazines, a sitting area with furniture that was probably custom-made, windows that overlooked gardens that looked professionally maintained. It was caged that looked like luxury accommodation, and Cassandra hated how much part of her wanted to appreciate the comfort despite knowing exactly what it represented. You'll stay here while we sort out the immediate threats, Luca said from the doorway, his posture relaxed but his attention clearly tracking her every movement as she examined her surroundings. I'll have my people bring you clothes and anything else you need. The estate has full security. Nobody gets in without my permission, which means you're safe from Lorenzo's retaliation. But Cassandra? His voice hardened slightly. Don't try to leave. The security works both ways. If you attempt to walk out, you'll be stopped. Gently if you cooperate. Less gently if you fight. I'd prefer to avoid using force, but I will if you make it necessary. So I'm a prisoner, Cassandra said flatly, turning to face him with expression that made her feelings about his benevolent captivity absolutely clear. Dressed up in nice accommodations with polite guards, but still fundamentally imprisoned against my will. And you expect me to what, thank you? Express gratitude for the kidnapping that's slightly more comfortable than the other kidnapping I experienced today? I expect you to be pragmatic, Luca replied, moving into the room with a kind of casual confidence that suggested he was very comfortable in his own space. You can rage against circumstances you can't change, or you can adapt to reality that keeps you alive. Your choice. But I'm not letting you leave until the situation with Lorenzo is resolved, which means you're going to be here for at least a few weeks. Make yourself comfortable. Try not to spend the entire time plotting escape attempts that won't succeed. And Cassandra? He paused at the door. I meant what I said about owing you. This isn't how I wanted to repay the debt of you saving my life. But it's the option I have available that doesn't result in your death. Try to remember that when you're articulating your logical objections. He left, the door closing behind him with finality that suggested the conversation was over whether Cassandra was satisfied with his explanations or not. She stood in the center of the beautiful prison trying to process that her life had gone from desperately attempting to resurrect her career to being held captive by Mafia Don in less than 24 hours, and she couldn't quite decide whether laughing or crying would be more appropriate response. She settled for fury instead, because anger was easier to manage than processing the terror that would set in once adrenaline finished wearing off. The next 3 days were study in sustained defiance, Cassandra testing every boundary Luca had established with the kind of systematic thoroughness that suggested she'd spent her journalism career investigating exactly how rules could be circumvented. She refused meals delivered to her room, preferring to force confrontations in the main house where Luca's men would have to physically prevent her from accessing the kitchen. She attempted to leave the estate at least twice per day, each time being stopped by guards who treated her with professional courtesy that somehow made being physically restrained even more infuriating. She demanded access to her phone, her laptop, any communication device that would let her contact the outside world, and was politely but firmly told that her electronic access was restricted until the security situation stabilized. You're being unreasonable, Luca observed on the fourth morning, finding Cassandra in his private library where she'd been conducting what she called research and he correctly identified as plotting. I'm not keeping you here to torture you. I'm keeping you here to keep you alive. The fact that you're treating basic protection like human rights violation suggests you're not thinking clearly about exactly how dangerous your situation actually is. Maybe my situation wouldn't be dangerous if you and your criminal friends didn't treat women like property to be won in psychotic games, Cassandra shot back, not looking up from the book she'd been pretending to read while actually studying the room's layout for potential security vulnerabilities. Just a thought. Have you considered not being part of a violent organization that makes existence dangerous for everyone around you? Daily, Luca replied with honesty that made Cassandra finally look at him directly. But changing the system from outside isn't possible when the system is designed to destroy anyone who poses external threat. Change requires being inside with enough power to actually shift dynamics rather than simply being eliminated as problem. So yes, I'm part of a violent organization. I'm also trying to make it less violent in ways that won't get me killed before I accomplish anything meaningful. It's complicated. Complicated, Cassandra repeated, her voice dripping with skepticism. That's one word for being a criminal who occasionally has ethical qualms. Are you expecting me to be sympathetic? Because I'm not. I'm furious that my investigation of people like you resulted in me being kidnapped and that my rescue from one criminal meant becoming prisoner of another. None of this is okay, Luca. None of it is justified by you claiming it's for my protection. You're right, Luca agreed, his expression suggesting genuine recognition of her point rather than dismissive agreement meant to end argument. It's not okay. It's not justified. It's simply the option available that doesn't result in your death. And I understand that you hate me for making choices about your safety without your consent. But Cassandra. He moved closer, his presence somehow dominating the space despite not actually being physically threatening. I spent 5 years looking for you. 5 years wondering who the woman was who'd saved my life and disappeared before I could even thank her. And now that I've found you, now that you're here and real and not just memory I'd half convinced myself I'd imagined while dying, I'm not letting you go. Not to Lorenzo's people who would break you. Not back to life where you'd continue investigating organizations that would eventually kill you. You saved me once. Let me save you now, even if my methods aren't what you choose for yourself. The intensity in his voice made something in Cassandra's chest tighten despite her determination to remain completely unmoved by his justifications. That's not saving, she said quietly. That's possession disguised as protection. There's a difference. I know, Luca replied, and his expression held something that looked almost like regret. But it's the best I can offer. Accept it or don't. Fight it or don't. Either way, you're staying here until Lorenzo and his people stop viewing you as target. How you spend that time is your choice. He left again, and Cassandra found herself staring at the closed door trying to reconcile the man who'd risked confrontation with his peers to rescue her with the man who was now keeping her imprisoned despite her clear objections. The cognitive dissonance was exhausting in ways that simple captivity wouldn't have been, because it would have been easier to hate him completely if he was simply monster rather than complicated person whose ethics were questionable but apparently present. The breaking point came 5 days into her captivity, when Cassandra's sustained defiance finally overcame Luca's impressive patience and their argument escalated from sharp words to something more physical. She'd been attempting once again to leave the estate, this time through gardens where she'd identified what looked like gap in security coverage, when Luca had intercepted her with expression that suggested he was done being understanding about her escape attempts. This is getting ridiculous, he said, blocking her path with body language that projected authority without being overtly threatening. You need to stop testing boundaries you're not going to successfully cross. The security is too good. My men are too well trained. You're not getting out until I decide you're safe to release. Accept that reality and stop wasting both our time with attempts that only work in movies where the plucky heroine defeats her captors through determination. Maybe I'll get lucky, Cassandra retorted, her fury at days of captivity finally boiling over into recklessness. Maybe your security will have off day. Maybe I'll find vulnerability you haven't accounted for. Or maybe, her hand came up before conscious thought could stop it, palm connecting with Luca's cheek in slap that was more symbolic than actually damaging but still represented line being crossed. Maybe I'm just done being reasonable about circumstances that are fundamentally unreasonable and I'm expressing that through inadvisable violence. How's that for pragmatic adaptation? For a moment they stood frozen, Cassandra's hand still raised, Luca's expression cycling through surprise and something that looked disturbingly like admiration for her audacity. Then he moved, not with violence or retaliation as she'd half expected, but with intensity that was somehow more overwhelming. His hand came up to catch her wrist, pulling her closer instead of pushing her away, his other hand sliding into her hair to tilt her head back, and then his mouth was on hers with kiss that was claiming rather than asking permission. Cassandra made sound of protest that transformed into something else entirely as the kiss deepened, her free hand coming up to push at his chest but somehow ending up fisting in his shirt instead, pulling him closer even as her mind screamed that this was terrible idea piled on top of all her other recent terrible ideas. She should bite him. Should knee him somewhere painful. Should remember that he'd been keeping her prisoner and that kissing her captor was textbook Stockholm Syndrome requiring immediate therapeutic intervention. But apparently her body had different priorities than her rational mind, because instead of fighting she found herself kissing him back with intensity that matched his, weeks of tension and fear and fury finding outlet in physical connection that transcended logic. His hands were somehow everywhere, her waist, her hair, her face, mapping her with touch that was possessive but also oddly gentle, like he was trying to memorize her through sensation alone. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Cassandra's first coherent thought was that she'd just made catastrophically poor decision and her second thought was that she wanted to do it again despite knowing exactly how stupid that would be. That didn't mean anything, she said, her voice coming out significantly less steady than she'd intended. That was, I'm still furious at you. Still planning to escape first chance I get. This doesn't change anything about our situation. Doesn't it? Luca's voice held knowing amusement that made Cassandra want to hit him again. Because from my perspective, you just kissed me back with enthusiasm that suggests you're not quite as opposed to my presence as you keep claiming. We can pretend it didn't happen if that makes you feel better about your principles. But Cassandra, that changed everything. You know it did. He was right, which was possibly the most infuriating part of the entire situation. Something had shifted between them, Tension that had been building since the yacht finally acknowledged and transformed into something neither of them had quite intended but both apparently wanted despite the terrible circumstances. Cassandra's resolve to maintain complete emotional distance from her captor had developed significant structural cracks, and she didn't quite know how to repair them when part of her didn't actually want to. The following week was studying gradually eroding boundaries, their arguments continuing but carrying undertones of something that wasn't quite hostility, their proximity feeling charged in ways that made casual interaction increasingly difficult. Luca stopped treating her quite as much like prisoner and more like guest whose presence he was genuinely enjoying despite the circumstances. Cassandra stopped fighting quite as hard against accommodations that were actually comfortable and man who was proving to be considerably more interesting than simply dangerous criminal. They had dinner together most evenings, conversations ranging from her journalism career to his complicated relationship with organization he was trying to reform from within, debates about ethics and pragmatism that somehow always ended in either argument or tension that felt like foreplay. Luca showed her parts of his estate she hadn't seen, introduced her to aspects of his operations that were surprisingly legitimate, generally acted like he was trying to prove that he was more than just violent captor despite that being objectively what he was. And Cassandra, despite her better judgment, found herself softening toward him in ways that probably required serious examination of her psychological state. He was attentive without being overwhelming, intelligent in ways that matched her own mind, protective without being controlling beyond the basic imprisonment. And he looked at her with intensity that suggested she wasn't just obligation he was fulfilling but person he was genuinely interested in knowing. "This is Stockholm Syndrome," Cassandra said one evening when they were sitting in the library after dinner, her defenses finally weakening enough to acknowledge what was happening between them. "I'm developing positive feelings for my captor because he's shown me basic kindness. That's textbook psychological response to captivity. We should both be alarmed by this development." "Probably," Luca agreed, setting down his wine glass to look at her directly. "But I don't think what you're feeling is Stockholm Syndrome. I think you're recognizing that we're more similar than you want to admit. Both of us trying to expose corruption in systems designed to protect themselves, both of us willing to take risks that more sensible people would avoid, both of us drawn to truth even when truth is dangerous. The captivity is circumstantial. The connection is real. That's very convenient interpretation that absolves you of guilt about keeping me prisoner," Cassandra observed, but her voice lacked its usual edge. "Telling yourself I'm developing real feelings rather than simply adapting to circumstances makes your actions seem less morally questionable. Does it matter?" Luca asked, moving closer until their faces were inches apart. "Whether it started as adaptation or genuine attraction. Whether circumstances forced proximity that led to connection we might not have developed otherwise. We're here now. We feel what we feel. The question is whether we're going to acknowledge it or continue pretending that what's building between us isn't real simply because the beginning was complicated." "It's more than complicated," Cassandra whispered, but she was already leaning toward him despite her words. "It's fundamentally messed up. Built on foundation of kidnapping and imprisonment. That's not romantic origin story. That's cautionary tale about trauma bonds." "Then we'll be cautionary tale," Luca murmured, closing the final distance between them. "But we'll be together while being cautionary. That seems like fair trade." The kiss when it came was different from that first violent collision of anger and attraction. Slower, deeper, carrying weight of acknowledged feelings rather than simple physical need. Luca's hands framed her face with gentleness that suggested he was trying to communicate something words couldn't quite express. And Cassandra found herself responding with surrender that had nothing to do with captivity and everything to do with admitting that she wanted this, wanted him, despite every logical reason suggesting she should maintain emotional distance. They moved from the library to Luca's bedroom in tangle of desperate touches and shed clothing, their progress interrupted by moments where they simply looked at each other with mixture of wonder and disbelief that this was actually happening. When they finally came together completely, when Luca moved above her with intensity that was focused entirely on her pleasure rather than simply his own, Cassandra felt something crack open in her chest that had been carefully guarded since her career had imploded. She'd spent 18 months convinced that trusting anyone was strategic error, that opening herself to vulnerability would only lead to more devastation. But Luca was looking at her like she was revelation rather than problem, his touch reverent despite the passion driving them both, and Cassandra found herself surrendering to feelings she'd been trying to deny for weeks. Afterward, they lay tangled together while moonlight painted patterns across the bedroom's expensive linens, and Cassandra felt simultaneously more safe and more terrified than she'd been since the yacht. Safe because Luca's arms around her felt genuinely protective rather than restrictive. terrified because falling for her captor was exactly the kind of poor judgment that had gotten her into this situation in the first place. "I'm still angry about the imprisonment," she said quietly, her head resting on his chest where she could hear his heartbeat returning to normal rhythm. "Just so we're clear. This doesn't mean I've accepted being held here against my will. I'm just taking advantage of the situation while processing my complex feelings about it." "Noted," Luca replied, his hand tracing idle patterns on her skin. "You're angry about the imprisonment but not opposed to the warden. I can work with that moral ambiguity." "You're insufferable," Cassandra muttered, but she was smiling despite herself. They might have continued the banter, might have spent the night exploring each other and postponing serious conversations about what this meant, if Luca's phone hadn't started ringing with tone that apparently indicated emergency. "Damn it," Luca said, reaching for the device with obvious reluctance. His expression shifted as he read the message, all contentment draining away in favor of dangerous focus that reminded Cassandra exactly what kind of man she'd just been intimate with. "Lorenzo's making his move. He's demanded you be returned within 24 hours or he's declaring war. And he's got the backing of the other two from the yacht. They're united against me taking you." "Then give me back," Cassandra said immediately, sitting up despite Luca's attempt to keep her close. "I'm not worth starting war over. Tell them I can be returned and avoid whatever violence you're planning." "No," Luca replied flatly. "I'm not giving you to people who would hurt you simply to avoid confrontation. We'll find another solution. My men can handle Lorenzo's forces if it comes to actual conflict. You stay here where you're safe." But Cassandra was already moving, her mind working through implications with the kind of strategic thinking that had made her good journalist before her judgment had been compromised by desperation. "This is my fault," she said, pulling on clothes with efficient speed. "I'm the reason you're about to be at war with 3 powerful men. I can't let you fight my battles when I can simply remove myself from the equation. Tell them I'll come willingly. That I'm returning of my own free choice. That ends the conflict before it starts." "Cassandra," Luca began, his voice carrying warning. "Tell them," she interrupted firmly. "Before people die because you're too stubborn to recognize that keeping me isn't worth the cost. I appreciate the protection. I do. But I'm not letting you destroy everything you've built just because you think you owe me debt from 5 years ago. Let me go." The argument that followed was intense but ultimately futile, because Cassandra had made her decision and Luca recognized that forcing her to stay would destroy whatever connection they'd just begun building. By dawn, arrangements had been made for her transfer back to Lorenzo, the terms negotiated to include guarantees about her treatment that Luca knew wouldn't be honored but that provided fig leaf of honorable surrender. "I'm coming for you," Luca promised as Cassandra was being prepared for departure, his hands framing her face in gesture that was both protective and possessive. "The moment you're transferred, the moment they think they've won, I'm coming to get you. This isn't goodbye. This is strategic retreat that sets up their complacency. Trust me." "I do," Cassandra replied, surprised by how much she meant it. "Which is probably the worst judgment I've demonstrated yet. But I do trust you. So come get me. So, before I have to save myself and make you feel inadequate about your rescue timing." "Deal," Luca murmured, kissing her one final time before she was led away to the vehicles that would deliver her back to the men who'd claimed her on the yacht. The transfer happened at neutral location, Cassandra handed over to Lorenzo's people with ceremony that felt like hostage exchange in spy film. Lorenzo himself smiled with satisfaction that made her stomach turn, his eyes holding promises of exactly what her return would mean for her immediate future. "Welcome back," he said pleasantly, his hand settling on her shoulder with possessive pressure. "We have so much catching up to do. And this time, there won't be any last-minute rescues to interrupt our entertainment." But he'd barely finished the sentence when Cassandra heard it, the roar of motorcycle engine approaching at speed that suggested reckless disregard for traffic laws, the sound growing rapidly closer. Lorenzo's head turned toward the noise, his expression shifting from satisfaction to alarm as he recognized what was about to happen. Luca appeared around the corner riding bike that looked like it cost more than most people's annual salaries, his body leaning into turns with athletic grace that made the pursuit look choreographed rather than desperate. He was closing the distance with single-minded focus that made Lorenzo's people scramble for weapons, made the drivers of the vehicles accelerate in attempted escape, made Cassandra's heart hammer with recognition that Luca had meant exactly what he'd said about coming for her immediately. The chase was brief but spectacular, Lorenzo's convoy attempting to outrun Luca's bike through streets that weren't designed for high-speed pursuit, their vehicles taking turns too fast and clipping barriers in ways that suggested panic rather than professional driving. The crash when it came was almost inevitable, the lead vehicle's tire blowing at precisely wrong moment, sending them careening into barrier with force that made metal scream and safety glass explode. Luca was there before the vehicle had fully stopped moving, his bike abandoned in favor of tearing open the door where Cassandra had been thrown against restraints that had kept her from worse injury. His hands were somehow gentle despite the urgency, checking her for damage before simply lifting her out of the wreckage and carrying her away from the chaos. "I told you I was coming," he said, his voice rough with emotion that suggested he'd been considerably more worried than his confident promises indicated. "Did you doubt me?" "Never," Cassandra replied, her arms wrapping around his neck despite the aches that suggested she'd have impressive bruises tomorrow. "Though your timing was cutting it close. Another 5 minutes and I might have had to save myself, which would have been embarrassing for your reputation as dramatic rescuer." "Can't have that," Luca agreed, his hold tightening as his men arrived to handle Lorenzo's people and secure the situation. "My reputation as dramatic rescuer is very important to me. Speaking of which, you're never leaving my protection again. I don't care how many logical objections you have to the arrangement. You're mine now. Permanently. We can negotiate the specific terms later, but the basic fact of your safety being my responsibility is non-negotiable." "That's very presumptuous," Cassandra observed, but she was smiling despite the pain. "Assuming I want to be yours permanently. Maybe I prefer my independence even if it comes with risk of being kidnapped by psychotic criminals." "Then I'll just have to convince you otherwise," Luca replied, carrying her toward the SUV that would take them back to his estate. "I have excellent persuasive abilities. You'll be thoroughly convinced by morning. Possibly multiple times." Promises, Cassandra murmured, but she was already looking forward to him making good on the threat. They'd figure out the complicated ethics of their relationship later. Right now, she was alive and safe and in the arms of a man who'd risked everything to rescue her twice. That had to count for something. Even if it meant her judgment remained spectacularly questionable. The aftermath of Lorenzo's failed recapture attempt was more complex than simple victory, the political ramifications rippling through their organization in ways that required careful management to prevent total destabilization. Lorenzo himself had died in the crash, not from the impact but from injuries sustained when his own men had apparently decided that their boss's obsession with reclaiming Cassandra wasn't worth dying for and had turned on him during the chaos. The other 2 men from the yacht had backed off their alliance once Lorenzo was no longer available to lead it, apparently deciding that war with Luca over one woman wasn't strategically sound when the woman in question was clearly under his permanent protection. Cassandra spent 3 days recovering from the crash injuries under supervision of Luca's private doctor, a woman who asked no questions about how her patient had acquired extensive bruising and what looked like minor concussion but who treated everything with professional competence that suggested she dealt with worse cases under more suspicious circumstances. Luca hovered throughout her recovery with attention that was simultaneously touching and slightly suffocating, his guilt about her injuries apparently overriding his usual composed demeanor in favor of making sure she had everything she could possibly need before she even knew she needed it. "You're going to give yourself an anxiety disorder if you keep checking on me every 20 minutes, Cassandra observed on the 3rd day, when she was finally feeling well enough to be annoyed by his constant presence rather than simply grateful for it. "I'm fine. The doctor said I'm fine. The bruises look worse than they actually are. You can stop acting like I'm made of glass that might shatter if you're not hovering protectively." "I'm not hovering," Luca protested, though his position sitting beside her bed while she read suggested otherwise. "I'm simply ensuring you have everything you need for comfortable recovery. That's different from hovering. That's being attentive." "That's hovering," Cassandra corrected, but she was smiling despite the criticism. "Though I appreciate the attention even if it's excessive. You can probably go back to running your criminal empire now. I promise I won't die while you're conducting whatever business requires your presence." "The business can wait," Luca replied, his hand finding hers with touch that was gentle despite the calluses that suggested he'd spent significant time training for violence. "You're more important than business meetings about territory disputes or profit margins. And Cassandra," his expression turned serious, "we need to discuss what happens next. Now that the immediate threat from Lorenzo is resolved. Now that you're safe enough to actually make choices about your future instead of simply surviving moment to moment." The shift in tone made Cassandra's attention sharpen despite her attempted casualness, her instincts recognizing that whatever Luca was about to say would be significant. "What do you mean what happens next?" she asked carefully. "I assumed I was still your prisoner until you decided the security situation was stable enough to release me back to my life. Has that changed?" "Everything's changed," Luca said quietly, his thumb stroking across her knuckles, an absent gesture that suggested he was processing complicated emotions. You were taken because of your investigation into criminal organizations. You nearly died multiple times because men like me operate in a world where women are considered property to be won rather than people deserving of autonomy. And you saved my life 5 years ago, which created debt I've been trying to repay through methods that were ultimately just another form of captivity. None of that is sustainable foundation for whatever this is between us. He stood, moving to his desk where he opened laptop and pulled up files that made Cassandra's eyes widen with recognition. This is everything you were looking for, Luca continued, turning the screen toward her so she could see the documents displayed. Proof of the criminal networks you investigated. Evidence of the financial structures supporting them. Documentation of operations that would absolutely result in prosecutions if presented to authorities who aren't compromised by corruption. It's your story, Cassandra. The one that destroyed your career because you couldn't prove it. Now you can. Cassandra stared at the screen, her mind struggling to process what Luca was offering her. You're giving me evidence against your own organization? Against the people you work with? That would implicate you in approximately a dozen different criminal enterprises. Why would you do that? Because you deserve the truth more than I deserve protection from consequences of my choices, Luca replied simply. Because your career was destroyed trying to expose exactly what these files prove. Because keeping you safe by keeping you prisoner isn't actually keeping you, it's just control disguised as protection. And because I love you enough to give you the choice I've been denying you since the yacht. Take the evidence. Publish your story. Resurrect your career. And then decide whether you want to come back to man whose world you've just helped dismantle. The confession was delivered with such raw honesty that Cassandra felt her carefully maintained emotional walls crumbling completely. You love me, she repeated, testing the words on her tongue like they were foreign language. You're in love with the journalist you kidnapped to protect from your criminal associates. Luca, that's either the most romantic or most psychologically disturbing thing anyone has ever said to me, and I genuinely cannot determine which. Both. Luca suggested, his smile holding vulnerability that she'd never seen him display before. I'm aware that falling for a woman whose life I've been controlling is questionable judgment. But my judgment has been questionable since the moment I saw your tattoo and realized you were the person who'd saved me. I'm not asking you to return my feelings. I'm not even asking you to stay once you've published your story. I'm just giving you the choice I should have offered from the beginning. Your freedom. Your career. Your life back. Use the evidence however you want. I won't interfere. He left before Cassandra could formulate response, apparently deciding that giving her space to process was more important than staying to see her immediate reaction. She sat staring at the laptop for what might have been minutes or hours, her mind working through implications that were both professionally thrilling and personally devastating. This was everything she'd lost her career trying to prove. Everything she'd been kidnapped trying to find. The evidence that would resurrect her reputation and possibly send multiple powerful people to prison. It was redemption handed to her by the man who'd been part of the system she'd been trying to expose, offered without conditions or expectations of reciprocation. And it meant she could leave, could return to her life, could finally stop being captive and become professional journalist again. The realization that she wasn't sure she wanted to leave was possibly the most disturbing development in a series of already disturbing events. Cassandra spent 2 weeks preparing her article, working with the kind of focused intensity that had characterized her best investigative pieces before the lawsuits had destroyed her credibility. She cross-referenced everything in Luca's files, verified sources, built narrative that was airtight enough that even the best lawyers wouldn't be able to dismantle it through procedural challenges. It was meticulous work that required her complete attention, which was convenient because it meant she didn't have time to examine her complicated feelings about man who'd given her the tools to potentially destroy him. Luca was conspicuously absent during those 2 weeks, his presence in the estate minimal enough that Cassandra suspected he was deliberately giving her space to work without the distraction of proximity. They crossed paths occasionally, brief encounters in hallways or shared meals where conversation remained carefully professional, but he never asked about her progress or tried to influence what she was writing. He'd given her the evidence and then stepped back, apparently trusting that she'd use it however her conscience dictated. The article was published on a Friday morning, uploaded to investigative journalism platform that had been created specifically for pieces that major publications wouldn't touch due to legal concerns. By Friday afternoon it had been picked up by every major news outlet in the country, the evidence so damning that even media organizations usually reluctant to anger powerful people couldn't resist the story. By Friday evening, multiple arrests had been made, federal investigations had been launched, and Cassandra's phone, which Luca had finally returned to her, was exploding with calls from editors who suddenly remembered her existence now that she'd proven her original story had been accurate all along. She was vindicated. Her career was resurrected. Everything she'd lost was suddenly available again, editors competing to hire her, opportunities materializing that would have seemed impossible just weeks ago. And Cassandra felt empty in ways that success shouldn't have created. She stood in the guest suite that had been her prison and then her workspace, staring at her phone with its dozens of missed calls and messages, trying to understand why professional triumph felt hollow when it should have been everything she'd been working toward for 18 months. The answer, when she finally admitted it to herself, was uncomfortably simple. Success meant leaving, and leaving meant not seeing Luca again, and apparently somewhere during her captivity she'd fallen in love with her captor despite every logical reason suggesting that was catastrophically poor judgment. Stockholm Syndrome, she whispered to her reflection in the bathroom mirror, her voice holding none of the conviction that medical terminology should have provided. Trauma bonding. Psychological adaptation to captivity. Not real feelings. Just conditioning. But it felt real. Felt like genuine love rather than simply coping mechanism. Felt like she'd found a person who understood her in ways no one else ever had, whose complicated ethics matched her own willingness to bend rules when pursuit of truth demanded it. Felt like losing Luca would hurt more than losing her career had, which was absolutely insane given that she'd known him for less than 2 months and he'd spent significant portion of that time keeping her imprisoned. Her judgment really was spectacularly bad. She was still standing in front of the mirror trying to convince herself that leaving was correct decision when she heard the sound. Footsteps in her bedroom that were too quiet to be guards or staff, that moved with the kind of predatory grace that could only belong to one person. Cassandra turned to find Luca leaning against the doorframe with expression that suggested he knew exactly what thoughts had been consuming her. "You haven't left yet," he observed, his voice neutral despite the intensity of his gaze. "The article published 12 hours ago. You've gotten dozens of job offers. You have your life back. And yet you're still here. Why?" "I'm processing," Cassandra replied, which was technically true if incomplete. "Figuring out logistics. Deciding which opportunities to pursue. The fact that I haven't immediately fled your estate doesn't mean I've decided to stay permanently. Doesn't it?" Luca moved into the bathroom with the casual confidence of someone very comfortable in his own space, his body language suggesting he could read her better than she'd realized. "Because from my perspective, you're standing in front of a mirror trying to convince yourself to do something you don't actually want to do. If you wanted to leave, you'd be gone already. The fact that you're still here suggests you're conflicted about abandoning the man who fell in love with you despite initially planning to keep you prisoner." "You're very sure of yourself," Cassandra observed, her defenses immediately activating against his accurate assessment. "Assuming I have feelings for you beyond simple gratitude for protection and appreciation for evidence that resurrected my career. Maybe I'm just being polite by not immediately disappearing after getting what I needed from you." "Maybe," Luca agreed, his hand coming up to trace her jawline with touch that made her breath catch. "Or maybe you're in love with me despite knowing you shouldn't be. Despite recognizing that what we have started with kidnapping and imprisonment and every red flag that suggests healthy relationship. Despite your excellent instincts warning you that I'm dangerous. You love me anyway. And that terrifies you more than anything else that's happened." "That's presumptuous," Cassandra managed, but her voice lacked conviction because he was right and they both knew it. "Is it?" Luca's other hand settled on her waist, pulling her closer with slow deliberation that gave her every opportunity to pull away if she chose. "Because I don't think I'm wrong. I think you're standing here trying to talk yourself into leaving when what you actually want is excuse to stay. So let me give you one. Stay because you want to. Because what we have is worth exploring despite complicated beginning. Because you love me and I love you, and sometimes that's enough reason even when logic suggests otherwise." "That's terrible reasoning," Cassandra protested weakly, her hands coming up to rest against his chest despite her verbal objections. "Love isn't sufficient foundation for relationship when one party spent weeks holding the other party captive. That's psychology textbook example of unhealthy dynamic." "Then we'll be textbook example," Luca murmured, his forehead resting against hers. "But we'll be together while being terrible example." "Cassandra, I'm not asking you to give up your career or your independence or anything except your insistence that leaving is the right choice simply because staying is complicated. Stay. Choose me. Choose us. And I promise I'll spend the rest of our lives proving that you made right decision despite everything suggesting otherwise." The kiss when it came was answer without words, Cassandra surrendering to feelings she'd been fighting since approximately the moment Luca had rescued her from Lorenzo's yacht. It was admission that love didn't always make sense, that sometimes the person you fell for was exactly wrong in all the logical ways while being absolutely right in ways that transcended logic. It was acceptance that her judgment would probably always be questionable, but at least it would be questionable in service of genuine feeling rather than simply professional ambition. They moved to the bedroom in tangle of desperate touches and shed clothing, their reunion carrying weight of decision made rather than simply physical need satisfied. When Luca moved above her with intensity that was focused entirely on her pleasure, when their bodies came together with the kind of synchronization that suggested deep familiarity despite limited time together, Cassandra felt something in her chest finally settle into certainty. This was what she wanted. This man, this life, this complicated love that had been forged through circumstances that should have destroyed rather than created connection. It wasn't what she'd planned. It wasn't what she'd expected when she'd followed that anonymous tip to abandoned warehouse. But it was real and it was hers and she was choosing it. Afterward, they lay tangled together while moonlight painted patterns across expensive linens, and Cassandra found herself laughing with the kind of giddy relief that came from finally making decisions she'd been avoiding. "What's funny?" Luca asked, his hand tracing idle patterns on her skin with touch that was possessive but gentle. "I was just thinking about how I'm going to explain this relationship to my friends," Cassandra replied, her amusement tinged with recognition of exactly how absurd their situation would sound to outside observers. "Hey, remember how my career was destroyed by publishing an article about criminal organizations? Turns out I'm now dating one of the criminals. Well, technically he kidnapped me first, but then we fell in love despite that being clearly Stockholm Syndrome. It's complicated. Please don't judge my life choices." "They're definitely going to judge your life choices," Luca observed with amusement that matched hers. "As well they should. Your judgment is spectacularly bad. But at least you're consistently poor at decision-making. That's something." "You're not supposed to agree with me about my bad judgment," Cassandra protested, though she was still smiling. "You're supposed to defend my choices and insist they're reasonable despite all evidence to contrary." "I could do that," Luca agreed, pulling her closer. "But lying to you seems counterproductive when we're building relationship on foundation of honesty about how deeply questionable all our choices have been. You have terrible judgment. I have worse ethics. Together we're probably going to scandalize everyone who knows us." "But Cassandra," his voice turned serious, "I've never been happier than I am right now. That has to count for something." "It counts for everything," Cassandra replied, and meant it despite knowing she'd spend significant time examining exactly what psychological processes had led to her falling for her kidnapper. 2 months later, they stood on the deck of the black yacht where everything had begun, except this time Cassandra was there voluntarily, wearing white dress that suggested ceremony rather than captivity, her hand in Luca's as they made promises that were legally questionable given his criminal activities but emotionally genuine in ways that transcended simple legal recognition. The ceremony was small and private, attended only by people who understood exactly how complicated their relationship was and had chosen to support it anyway. Luca's men served as witnesses, their presence protecting the perimeter against anyone who might decide that disrupting the wedding would be strategically advantageous. Cassandra's handful of friends who'd remained loyal through her career collapse attended despite their concerns about exactly what kind of man she was marrying, their expressions suggesting they were prepared to intervene if this turned out to be coercion disguised as romance. "I, Luca Mancini, take you, Cassandra Monroe, to be my wife," Luca said, his voice carrying across the water with solemnity that suggested he understood the weight of what they were promising each other. "To protect and cherish and give you freedom to leave whenever your excellent instincts finally convince you that staying with criminal was a terrible idea. I promise to love you despite your catastrophically bad judgment. To support your career despite it potentially exposing my operations. To never again keep you somewhere against your will unless it's absolutely necessary for your survival. This is my vow." "That's possibly the worst wedding vow ever written," Cassandra observed, but she was laughing despite the tears threatening. "You're supposed to promise eternal devotion, not acknowledge that I might eventually develop better judgment and leave. But fine. I, Cassandra Monroe, take you, Luca Mancini, to be my husband. To love and challenge and remind you constantly that kidnapping is not acceptable basis for relationship. I promise to try not to investigate your criminal activities too thoroughly. To accept that sometimes love makes no logical sense. To stay as long as my questionable judgment keeps convincing me that this is where I belong. This is my vow." They were married on the black yacht under moonlight that matched their first encounter, bound not by force but by choice that transcended every logical objection either of them could articulate. It was beginning that should have been ending, relationship that defied every rule about healthy dynamics, love that had been forged through circumstances that would make excellent cautionary tale about Stockholm Syndrome and trauma bonding. But it was theirs. Built on honesty about exactly how complicated they both were. Sustained by genuine care that had survived imprisonment and rescue and multiple near-death experiences. Chosen rather than forced, which made all the difference between captivity and commitment. As they stood together watching the sun rise over water that had witnessed both their first meeting and now their union, Cassandra reflected that her judgment really had been spectacularly bad from the moment she'd followed that anonymous tip to abandoned warehouse. But sometimes, she was learning, bad judgment led to unexpected places that turned out to be exactly where you were supposed to be all along. Even if getting there required being kidnapped twice, falling for your captor, and generally demonstrating exactly the kind of decision-making that journalism ethics courses warned against. At least her life would never be boring. And she'd finally found the story worth telling, even if it was her own. Dive deeper into dangerous romance. If The Black Yacht left you craving more intense Mafia romance. Subscribe for exclusive bonus content, extended epilogues revealing Luca and Cassandra's first year of marriage, deleted scenes of their developing relationship during captivity, and bonus chapters exploring how Cassandra navigates being both investigative journalist and wife to criminal boss. Explore the expanded universe, discover other members of Luca's organization finding unexpected love, learn the complete story of the assassination attempt that brought them together 5 years ago, and find out what happens when Cassandra's journalism exposes threats that force them both into hiding. Join the family, connect with readers who love defiant heroines, morally complex heroes, enemies to lovers tension, and romance that doesn't shy away from discussing the psychological complexity of captivity and consent. Leave your review. Your feedback helps other readers discover intense romance with actual stakes and helps us create more stories featuring sharp-tongued journalists, protective criminals, and couples who build love from impossible circumstances. Coming soon. Black Yacht Chronicles, Luca and Cassandra's complete story as they navigate marriage between two worlds. The Rescue Protocol, other women saved from Lorenzo's network finding freedom and love. Mancini Empire, how Luca transforms his organization from the inside with Cassandra's investigative expertise. Stay connected for weekly updates, character interviews, behind-the-scenes insights about yacht-based mafia operations, and bonus content featuring Cassandra's increasingly creative threats. Subscribe now and never miss a moment of dangerous romance and witty defiance. Thank you for experiencing Luca and Cassandra's journey from captivity to commitment. Your engagement means everything. May you always find the courage to make questionable decisions that lead to unexpected happiness, and may your judgment be just bad enough to create interesting stories worth telling. Some anchors are meant to hold you in place. Others are meant to keep you from drifting away.